Another issue on Capitol Hill today, and that is climate change. A House committee will hear testimony on a cap-and-trade program. Let's head back to Capitol Hill to Peter Koch with more on this and also on the headlines coming out from the Treasury. Peter.
Betty, thanks very much. Very busy day here on Capitol Hill. You mentioned those headlines about the 10 banks being allowed to repay their TARP funds. Well, the other hot story here in Washington, pardon the pun, is climate change and this legislation moving through the House of Representatives just in the past few weeks, this cap-and-trade program. And joining me now is MidAmerican Energy Holdings Chairman David Sokol. Of course, MidAmerican, part of Berkshire Hathaway. Mr. Sokol's here to testify on the Hill this morning about this cap-and-trade program. Your concerns with what is moving through Congress, but I got to ask you first of all about this news with regard to TARP and these banks. Berkshire Hathaway does have stakes in some of these TARP recipient banks. What do you make of this news? Care to comment at all? 10 banks being allowed to finally repay. Do you see it as a sign of progress?
I think it is progress. You know, a group of the banks went in the emergency room last fall here in the U.S. They moved to the intensive care unit in January. It looks like a few of them are getting discharged now, and that's certainly a stabilizing force in the financial sector. So that's good news, I think.
All right. Well, let me ask you about the primary topic, the reason you're here, and that is this climate change legislation. You all one of the biggest energy players, power players in the country. I want to get your sense about this bill moving through the House that would cap carbon dioxide emissions, create this trading program. There are lots of huge debate about this already. You have problems with what's moving through the House. Tell me why.
Well, let me break it into two parts. The caps, trying to reduce CO2 by 83% by 2050, and then some interim steps. If that's government policy, we're fine with that, and we will achieve that through our utilities. And that's a huge cost unto itself. But again, that's policy, and if that is the policy of the land. The trading side for utility sector is a disaster because it will basically duplicate the cost for all of our consumers. In our states, it reflects roughly a 28% tax increase on consumers, but it doesn't reduce a single ton of CO2. So put the caps in place, we'll meet them, but do away with the trading side from a utility perspective because it will be hugely unacceptable to consumers.
Some of your colleagues in the power industry say the only way they can meet these caps is to have these allowances from the government, in essence, these emission credits to be able to make the transition to a less carbon dioxide filled world. Why don't you think that those allowances, those credits are a reasonable tool to use?
Well, because it creates a false tax to the system. The reality is the only way you remove CO2 from a coal-fired or gas-fired power plant is to either replace it, because there is no technology today to strip CO2 out of the exhaust stream. So those dollars are going to have to be spent to ultimately meet these caps anyway. That's where the money should be spent. Adding this trading regimen to that as well, again, as a duplicative cost. A number of the utilities are okay with that because they're protected under state law that they can just pass it through to the consumer. We think somebody has to be here representing the consumer because we're talking about numbers that are, for the average family, it's $120 per month increase in their electric bill, and they're not doing anything. Nothing of value comes from it.
All right, Mr. Sokol, let me ask you to sit tight if we could. We have a commercial break coming up. Got more questions to ask you about your testimony up here on Capitol Hill. Right. Joined here by MidAmerican Energy Holdings Chairman David Sokol, back after this short break from here in Washington.